Hi everyone, I'm Ben.
I'm Tyler.
I'm Ian.
And today we're going to be presenting on the second chapter of Dana Dunn's book. The title of the chapter is Fundamental Psychosocial Concepts for Understanding Disability. Okay, so the first concept we have is the insider-outsider distinction. And Dunn defines insiders as those who have a disability or who have had a disability. So this is important to know because outsiders, as you can imagine, have to imagine what it is like to have a disability because they would be people who have not had a disability or do not have a disability. And a really important point for this is that the presence of a disability does not indicate quality of life. So just because one has or doesn't have a disability doesn't mean that their life will be better or worse. And from now on, we'll be defining people with disabilities as PWDs, so that's a helpful acronym to know, or abbreviation to know, sorry. And the way it works is PWDs may think of their disability as another trait that they can't really control, like their height, their hair color, their eye color. It's just something that these insiders live with, and they're totally okay with that. And insiders are more aware of how outsiders treat them, so they understand that sometimes there's infantilizing talk around them, or outsiders will treat them lesser for no reason just because they have a disability. And that really isn't fair, but that's just something that happens in the real world. And the final point for this is that insiders do not know how other insiders perceive the world. So just because multiple people have a disability doesn't mean that each disability is the same. So for example, blind people don't know what deaf people experience or vice versa. The next concept we'll be going into is called the mind-thine problem. And this was an exercise performed by Wright in 1983. What this was designed to do was to increase sensitivity toward the real nature of disability. And it allowed outsiders, or really other people, to take the perspective of PWDs. The way this exercise worked is there were multiple people in a room, and they were asked to either, if they were an insider, write down their own disability, or write down a disability that they thought they would be comfortable with. And then they shuffled the papers around, and then they ended up with a disability of another person. And what happened there is the researcher asked, which disability would you like to keep? And most of the time, the participants chose their own original disability. So this is important to understand and important to know how to do because it can open up a very important dialogue between insiders and outsiders, or just people in general, about disability and how people are more comfortable with their own disability and how disabilities can change from person to person. So there are multiple reasons for the mind-thine problem. The first one would be familiarity. So people are comfortable with what they have, they're familiar with how they cope with it, and change can be scary and intimidating, so changing from one disability to another can be a little too much sometimes. The next reason is self-identity, where the disability that a PWD has is part of their identity. Like I said before, it's like their hair color, their height, their weight, it's just something that they have, and it's really important to them, and it can seem implausible or impossible to go without. The next reason is coping. So people know how to live with their own condition. They know they've lived with it potentially for their whole lives or for a long period of time. So they don't need other people's sympathy or like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. They know how to live with it, and they're okay with living with it for their whole life. The next one is the psychological spread. So this would mean that another disability would seem worse off, or there's more negative aspects associated with another disability as compared to theirs. So the last three reasons, the first one is kind of the inverse of the last one we talked about, would be the positive aspects or secondary gains of your own disability, sorry. So this would mean that you see or you have a lot of positive aspects that go along with the disability that you have, and you don't want to change that. You're okay with the disability that you have, and you're happy with the benefits that come along with it. The next reason would be energy conservation. And this is pretty straightforward. It's just saying that changing disabilities or potentially having a new disability could take up a lot of energy. Energy that you're not used to spending on this other type of disability because you know what it's like to have your original one. And finally is reactance, which would be resistance or opposition to exchanging a current state. So you just potentially just do not want, you would not like to have another disability or a new one, you just want to keep what is familiar to you.
So in Chapter 2, Dr. Dunn talks about the somatopsychological relation. Somatopsychology is how physique influences a person's self-image, how a person's physique influences his or her exchanges with others, and the choice of activities that the person involves himself with. There's a conceptual link to Kurt Lewin's person-environment relation here. The idea being that an accurate account of behavior can be attributed to a little bit of the environment and a little bit of the disposition of the individual, not one or the other so much. And to go along with somatopsychology, behavioral accomplishments are relative to the person with disability, or PWD. So a war veteran who has both legs removed in an accident might consider it a success to be able to run well after having an operation done, whereas another PWD with a different disability might not consider that so much of a success, but something that they can do regularly. So behavioral success is relative to the PWD. And the next thing that Dr. Dunn talks about in Chapter 2 is adaptation to a disability. Questions come up, is a congenital disability or developed disability to be adapted to, which one requires more of an adaptation? The onset of an acquired disability causes the affected person to begin a process of psychological adaptation. And adaptation is defined as a dynamic, so always changing and ongoing somatopsychological process. Again, has to do with the physique and how this influences the behavior of the PWD that a person with a disability undergoes as they progress toward their idealized destination of adjustment to the disability. And so adjustment, being the next slide, is being satisfied with to quote Kurt Lewin again, the person-environment relation, so that any bodily change isn't a preoccupation so much, and the individual can constructively focus on abilities and what can be accomplished. And some of these are characteristics of adjustment that we see in PWDs. Somebody who's well-adjusted might exhibit a lot of independence, problem-solving skills, positive self-concept, and ability to navigate social and physical environments in the presence of their disability. And the final step of this is the acceptance of a disability, finally, which is marked by the disability becomes incorporated into the person's self-concept in everyday life and is no longer looked at as though it's not a part of the person, but now it's a part of their self-identity. And the individual views a disability as an outcome. It doesn't lessen their self-worth. It's characterized by a realistic response. It's a realistic recognition of the disability, which requires the PWD to expand their values and beliefs about disability. So they kind of have to, do some introspection maybe in order to fully accept their disability. And there's one more slide, which is identifying assets. Assets are kind of like resources that are distinctive to every person. So this may be a dispositional quality or a hobby that one can identify with. They are beneficial in developing a deeper sense of disposition, as we just said, given the presence of a disability. And it can allow a PWD to be distinctive or to orient more towards groups. So an asset might be something that sets somebody apart in a way that they want to be set apart and distinctive, or it might allow them to sort of integrate into a group a bit easier and to get along with the group a bit easier.
So I'm going to be discussing individuation and de-individuation. And so this is important to recognize. So when we're talking about people with disabilities, we're inherently talking about people first language and not grouping individuals into collective categories and de-individualizing them. And so de-individualization is the loss of individualism and responsibility by grouping. And so we may look at a particular group and say, that particular group did this, as opposed to looking at what those particular individuals did on an individual level. So with regards to people with disabilities, the loss of identity when grouping with other people with disabilities inherently loses that sense of identity. Everyone has a unique story, everyone has a unique disability, everyone has a unique self. And so that's really important to recognize that. Again, people first language, it reinforces the idea that there aren't any differences between individuals that do not have a disability and those that are living with a disability. And so the psychosocial fundamentals, these are rooted in relations between the person and the environment. So again, individuals living with disabilities, there's nothing inherently wrong with that individual. Their disability is the result of their environment and social constructs. And so this is really important to recognize. And also the importance of individuality. Again, we are all individuals. We're not a collective group. We're not labeled into something that isn't just solely ourselves. And so doing this understands sort of the requiring of listening and acknowledgement. So we have to listen to individuals and listen to their own personal stories. We have to do that in order to understand the struggles that they're trying to overcome, whether they're living with a disability, whether they're not. I guess the importance of the importance that we are all unique, again, and just the importance of listening and understanding that we all have unique experiences and this contributes to our own self-identity, which is important. And so our article Connection deals with Dr. Mahzarin Banaji and Tessa Carlsworth at Harvard University. And so with Banaji's lab, they're dealing with implicit attitude associations. And so they were the individuals that came up with the implicit attitude association test. And so this is important. Implicit biases and attitudes are biases and attitudes that we're not consciously aware of, whereas explicit biases and attitudes are are things that we are aware of. And so they were looking at implicit and explicit attitudes towards disability and a number of other things like sexual orientation, gender, weight, skin color, things of that nature. And so when they were looking particularly at explicit biases, they saw a shift towards neutrality by 24% with regards to disability. So this is important. People are shifting their explicit biases away from negativity with regards to individuals that are living with disabilities. But it's interesting, with implicit biases, they saw basically no shift. It was 2%. And they don't anticipate this changing over the next 150 years. And so this is really important. Our implicit biases, the biases that we are cognizantly aware of, are remaining the same. And so we really have to tackle ways in which we can shift our own implicit biases. And again, with regards to future research, so they were looking at the upper and lower confidence intervals for this study. And they saw no statistical significance in the terms of they were expecting long-term change with regards to shifting towards neutrality or shifting away from neutrality towards more towards a negativity. And again, talking about this is really important. We have to address the social psychology of disability and its importance, and hopefully you took away a lot from this video.